Welcome, Susan Kirtley, professor at Portland State and also director of rhetoric and composition and director of comic studies. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited that you're here with me, even if it's virtual. And I want to hear all about your journey and, well, how you got into comic studies.
Well, it was very much a happy accident. I feel very lucky because I was able to bring my love of comics into my scholarly life, but it wasn't always that way. I mean, I've loved comics since I was a child, and I've told the story many times that in elementary school, there was a boy on the playground and he said, "Girls don't read comics." And I have this contrary personality. So if someone tells me I can't or shouldn't do something, I'm like, oh, I will do it. I will do it with a passion. So when I was told girls shouldn't read comics, I was like, okay, I'm going to read all the comics. And I fell in love with the X-Men to begin with. And then I just read everything I could get my hands on, and it became this great obsession and passion, which lasted, through college and graduate school. But it was kind of, this thing that I did. And then I had my academic work where I was studying rhetoric and visual rhetoric and composition and writing. And they didn't really come together until actually after I had my PhD and I was teaching. And I thought, well, maybe I can kind of sneak this in. And I started teaching Lynda Barry in some memoir and classes and essay writing classes. I was teaching 100 Demons. I just thought it was such a great visual sort of essay form. And so then the students just responded so enthusiastically. And so I started bringing in comics more and more. And I thought, wow, this is really something. And so I started really looking critically at the comics and thinking about them from the scholarly perspective and bringing them into my teaching. And I just sort of fell into this field really by accident, but I feel so incredibly lucky to have found this field that is so welcoming. And it's so exciting because I feel like there's so much work to be done still. So it was a very happy accident of bringing this great passion into my academic life.
Your training's in rhetoric and composition, and we can talk about this now or later, but did that give you a kind of toolbox that you just didn't see in other scholarly approaches to comics?
Well, one thing that I love about comic studies is, comics are clearly interdisciplinary. So you get, people coming from film studies, you get people coming from art, you get people coming, from all these history, all these different backgrounds, and coming from, I think, rhetoric, it gives me a different kind of lens because that's my training. And so I'm always thinking about, oh, well, this reminds me of this sort of rhetorical situation, or they're speaking to the audience in this way. And so it gives me this way of looking at things. And so it's a lot of fun for me to sort of apply my training, my rhetorical training, as well as my background in composition, which is all about process, to my scholarly analysis. So I feel like in comic studies, it has room for all these different sort of perspectives and lenses and different ways of looking at things. So for me, it's a lot of fun because, again, I get to, in the most positive way, I get to nerd out with like looking at, the rhetorical angle on all of these comics. So yeah, it's I think hopefully more and more people will apply that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your work, of course. Okay, Lynda Barry, you mentioned a kind of this, maybe as part of your origin story, coming across Lynda Barry, but then you actually wrote an entire monograph, Lynda Barry, Girlhood Through the Looking Glass, that went on to win a Eisner Award, like the most significant award you can get. Why Lynda Barry?
Well, I think, she's amazing. I mean, for one thing. But the thing is, as I said, I was teaching her. And because I'm really, as a teacher, I over-prepare. I wanted to do all this research on Lynda Barry. And when I started doing the research, there wasn't much written about her. And I thought, how can this be? She's this huge figure in the world of comics and just amazing and I love that she's working in all these different ways and different forms and doing all these interesting things. And there wasn't much written about her. And I was frustrated. And I thought, well, someone needs to write about her. And I ended up doing this presentation at a conference about, it was just a, conference presentation about how I was using Lynda Barry in the classroom. And afterward, I ended up talking with Professor Tom Inge. And I remember kind of saying to him, well, somebody needs to do this book and, blah, blah, blah. And somebody needs to do this. And he was gently sort of encouraging me, like, well, maybe you should do this. And I was convinced that I was not the person to do this, because I felt completely ill-equipped. I thought, well, no, because if I'm in comic studies, I need to learn about art. I need to learn about history. I need to learn about, publishing history. I need to learn about all of these things. And I was like, no, it's not going to be me. And I remember Tom Inge he just kind of sat me down and he said, well, tell me about the comics that you like. Tell me about what you like to read. And then I went on this like monologue, kind of a villain length monologue. Like, well, first I read the X-Men, and then I read this, and then I read that. And there's just huge monologue. And I remember he looked at me and he said, I think you'll be fine. You'll learn what you need to know. And he was so encouraging. But I think he could perhaps see that my enthusiasm for Lynda Barry, for comics in general, would encourage me to try and I still don't feel like there's so much more that I need to know, but would encourage me to push me through to find out what I needed to know to write the book. And I think she's such a great figure, and it was important to me to have this as a resource. And I really see it as a beginning of a conversation, as so much in comic studies. It's like, let's get this conversation started, because she deserves so much more attention. And it's exciting to be in comic studies, because there's all these different, different creators and different things for us to talk about and explore. So once again, it was a happy accident. But I'm very excited. It was a great labor of love to write about Lynda Barry, because she deserves more scholarly attention. And again, she's always changing and doing new things. I mean, sometimes I feel like I can barely put a sentence together, but here she is. She's doing these short comics. She's doing long things. She's doing these sort of heuristic workbooks. She's always doing something new. So I'm just excited to kind of write this book, and hopefully lots more scholarship will be coming on Lynda Barry. So,
Susan, was there a kind of little nugget of a surprise for you when you wrote the book or writing the book, something that you just didn't expect?
I'm trying to think. I will say there were a lot of moments along the way, because I came through and I had read her comics, but I hadn't read her essays. I hadn't read her novel, Cruddy. And for me, again, just to be so overwhelmed and impressed by all the different forms she works in. And I was able to do an interview with her, and she talks about, she's following the image, and sometimes that's an essay, and sometimes it's a comic, and sometimes it's a collage. And I was just in awe of the way that she's able to work in so many different forms, because I knew her primarily through comics. She is a great prose writer. She's a great essayist, a great novelist. And I think that was a surprise to me. And again, getting to work and talk with Lynda Barry was a delightful surprise, because, I had in my mind what she might be like, and getting to meet her was a delightful surprise, because she was all of those things, personable and witty, but she was also even more, she was talking when I did the interview, she was talking all about the psychology she was studying, and she's studying the system of the brain, and just really, absolutely a genius, as has been proven by her recent MacArthur Award. So,
right, yeah. Documented. Some of my students are surprised, the ones that do know at least 100 Demons, that she's mixed, that she's Filipina and Anglo-American, but that's always a surprise for them, and I love it. And I'm like, well, can we read her now through that lens? Does it do something? Is there a resonance there that we can kind of find? Speaking of your rhetorical approach, you've talked about X-Men and superheroes and kind of love of that. Tell me a little bit about why, Jason Aaron's Thor, and then maybe you can walk us through a couple of these panels of, you know, yeah, we've got a woman and she's Thor. I love it.
Yes, I was very intrigued by this storyline. As I said before, I read all the comics. I read the auteur comics. I read superhero comics. I love them all. And so I was excited to see that I sort of was following the news and I saw this interesting run on Thor. So I was excited to see what would happen with this. I was cautiously optimistic about Jason Aaron's run on Thor, having loved his other work, but I was a little concerned. But when I read it, I'm getting my book right now. I just really enjoyed the fact that it was unabashedly, I think, feminist, you know, and that she doesn't apologize for it. She defends it. And so it was really fun for me to read these because it reads a lot like, you know, a lot of these debates in comics that we see about, oh, you know, we shouldn't have, you know, female superheroes shouldn't take on this mantle. They shouldn't do this. They should do this. And so there's been a lot of conversation around this issue. So it was fun for me to see this sort of unabashedly feminist title coming out.
Mm-hmm. And by a male creator, right? Perhaps right. Even bigger surprise for us, right?
Right. And he said in interviews that he is a feminist, and that is so fantastic because, you know, we should all be feminists, you know? So yes, I think it's wonderful. Obviously I've said before, I want to see more female creators, and I also enjoy seeing male creators take on these intersectional topics. So yeah, I was very excited.
Absolutely. So Susan, while I've got you here with us today, can you just walk us through a little bit of, you know, Aaron's Thor?
Yes, I see. So I've got my book here as well, because again, I have to have all my tabs, and I've got my book with all my tabs because that's the kind of scholar I am and lover of comics. So one thing I love about comics, obviously, is how it has these special affordances and ways of getting its message across. And I love how in this particular run, the art works with the text, works with the colors, works with the lettering. And I love, I think you have the example right, where this is, I think, issue number 2. And I love that you have this gorgeous art and the colors is sort of representing this amazing celestial transformation. But then you have this wonderful dialogue. I'm a huge lettering nerd. I'm completely obsessed with lettering, which I think is valued for how it tells the story. And I love this whole conversation that Thor is having with herself when she's saying, you know, by the golden spires of Asgard. And it has this kind of, you know, Thor-like old-time Scandinavian legend font. And then it has this other font where she's saying, I'm wearing armor and a mask. Yeah, a mask is probably a good idea. And she's having this wonderful conversation with herself. And then we also have the speech bubbles, or the speech balloons here, with some are her thought process and some are her speaking. And she says, I can't believe I am holding Thor's Mjolnir. Does that make me? And then there's the, you know, the Thor god, nay, no time for questions. Midgard is in peril. And I just love, I think, the way that page in particular brings in, we have these, you know, the speech and thought balloons, we have the lettering, and it all works together to show us that we've had this amazing transformation. But, you know, there's a part of her that's Thor, but there's also this very human part of her who's trying to acclimate in this humorous way. So I really love that page because I think it, you know, if I was working with students, we could talk about the balloons and the lettering and how it tells this complicated story. So I really love that page. Should we talk about the other one as well?
Yes, please.
Yes. Okay. I absolutely adore that particular sequence because Thor she's battling with Crusher Creel. And it seems to me it's like this superhero version of all the haters online who were attacking Jason Aaron's run on Thor. And they were like, no, Thor's a man. You can't make, a female assume the mantle of Thor. And there were all these sort of haters online getting cranky about it. And it's almost like Jason Aaron has lifted this, this vitriol, this horrible dialogue from the haters into the pages of the comics as represented by the absorbing man, which is it's so on the nose. Like he's trying to absorb the woman's power, but he's a Crusher Creel of absorbing man trying to sort of absorb and vanquish Thor. And it's just this wonderful dialogue where he's like, Thor, are you kidding me? I'm supposed to call you Thor? Damn, feminists are ruining everything. And then he goes on, you want to be a chick superhero? Who the hell cares? Be your own identity, which was one of those lines we heard a lot, like find your own identity. Thor's a dude, one of the last manly dudes left. And then he goes on and on. And then eventually she knocks him out and says, or he says, like, who, what kind of Thor are you? And she says, the kind who just broke your jaw. And that's for saying feminist like it's a 4-letter word, and also for the robbing. So it's this wonderful conversation that it feels like it's lifted out of the critiques of the comic onto the pages. And it's so satisfying for me as a reader, I have to say, even though it's really kind of on the nose, it's really satisfying to see him vanquished in that way, and she just, she pummels him. She shows that, she is worthy, obviously, and the hammer responds to her. And it does so in even sort of new and unique and interesting ways in order to vanquish him. And it's just so much fun to see that in the pages of the comics. So
absolutely. Yeah. I love how you walked us through your reading, and also really kind of emphasizing the importance of all of the different elements involved in comic storytelling, the lettering, the balloon and speech and thought placements, the action, but also the pauses, right? This sort of great moment where it just takes a little bit of a pause. Mm-hmm. And she's like, hold on, what's going on here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love it. Thank you. Yeah. You also you practice what you preach and you publish what you preach. Tell us how you bring comics into your classroom. And I know this sort of inspired also this co-edited volume.
Absolutely. And yeah, this volume is a project I did with colleagues and friends, Antero Garcia and Peter Carlson, and they're good friends. I actually met them at a Comic-Con. Antero's a professor in education at Stanford, and Peter's a K-12 teacher. He's now a literacy specialist, but it was great the way it brings people together. And so it's very important for me to teach with comics. And so this project came out of trying to get more experts to give us advice about this. And I think this is a really, in terms of comic studies as an umbrella, I think comics pedagogy is a field that's going to be expanding and blossoming, and I'm seeing it happening, and it's really exciting. I think initially I started teaching, you have on there different ways of teaching with comics, and initially I was teaching with comics. So I was teaching like essay writing or memoir, and I would bring them in as an example, like, look at this kind of cool thing. And I think that's absolutely relevant. If we're teaching, history, why not bring in March, bring in Mouse, bring in these great examples. I also get to teach about comics. So I'll teach comics history or comics theory, where we're sort of looking and, taking it apart, and we're looking at comics as comics. And so I'm very lucky because at Portland State, I get to teach these classes about comics history, comics theory. It's not always, I think, practical for everybody to do that. They don't have a school system or a university where they can do that. But I think you can also teach through the production of comics. So I think of comics not only, in terms of as example texts, model text, but I also think of, I'm very interested in this idea of the process of making comics as a way of thinking through ideas and processing information. So I do a lot of that. So even if I'm teaching like a let's say a literature class on, the contemporary novel or something. Or I'll have the students, do this Ivan Brunetti adapted exercise where I'm like, okay, think about this particular text, and I want you to illustrate it in 4 panels. And then I want you to illustrate it in 2, and then I want you to illustrate it in 1. And that is a way of getting the students to sort of think about what are the essential elements of this particular novel. How can I distill it down to the essence? What is the core of it? And so, and again, that's adapted from Ivan Brunetti, but it's like a way of thinking and processing information. So I'll do a lot of comics production, even in a literature class or a composition class. Sometimes I'll ask my students in a composition class to illustrate their writing process, because, we think in different ways. And so it's a chance for them to show and write and create and communicate in a different way. So I like to think about using comics, again, as subjects worthy of study, absolutely, but also as a way of processing information and communicating information. So we can bring that into all disciplines. And again, working on volumes like this, I've talked with science teachers, and I was talking to a science teacher who had students, doing comics about the life cycle of certain animals and things like that. So I think it's a great way of encouraging students to think and communicate differently. So again, I'm spoiled because it's just a lot of fun for me to experiment in all these different ways. And I think it's going to become even more relevant, even more discussed, because we live in an increasingly visual-based culture. And when we're asking our students to compose, they're often composing for a website or a screen, or thinking about how do we pair text and image in different ways, even if it's not necessarily in comics, but that's the reality. That's the world that we live in right now.
Absolutely. Giving them the critical tools to both create and to understand more deeply, to take a moment, right? I noticed when I teach comics or film, there's almost a taken for grantedness, right? And then when we slow them down and show them like, wow, and then they're like, I had no idea, or they're like, I tried doing it, but it's so hard, right?
Absolutely. And again, I think that's really important too, to think about. I want them my students not to just be creators, but also educated and thoughtful consumers of these visual texts too. When you think about, political campaigns and signs and advertising, really, really thinking critically about how that information is presented.
Susan, you are on lots of sort of executive committees, MLA for the Graphic Narrative, Comic Studies Society. You were up on stage getting your Eisner. That's also, and you were also part of a part of that committee at a certain point. Why are these institutions? Why for comic studies might this kind of recognition, this kind of service, this kind of space and place be important?
It's interesting because I think of myself as very much an introvert reading my comics in my little room, and so it's actually a big challenge for me to try and work to develop these sort of institutional structures and communities. But I think it's really important in order to support one another and encourage scholarship and the next generation of scholars. So as you pointed out, I've worked with the Comic Studies Society and the MLA Forum for Graphic Narratives, and started the Comic Studies program at Portland State. And really, my goal is that I want to create these institutional spaces, because that's where we get funding for graduate students. That's where we get jobs for our colleagues. That's how we get grants and funding to do this important research. So I think that it's important to kind of have these structures and help develop these structures, not just because I want to legitimize comic studies, which is great, and we are legitimate and should be, but I really think that as scholars, I want to support one another and support our students and sort of build these foundations so that our scholarship can really flourish, because it's hard, when you're working all by yourself. Mm-hmm. And I mean, so many scholars were paying for, our research trips and, buying all these old comics. And, it's a challenge. And so I think that these sort of structures can help support one another and help the field really flourish. So I think, and also that sense of community. I found comic studies to be the most welcoming and supportive community of scholars. You know, when you ask a question, people are right there. So I think these foundations can help us help one another and foster new generations of scholars. So it's a challenge for an introvert to go out there and try to make these connections and do this kind of work. But I really am hopeful that we can, again, really be there for one another and for, especially for our emerging scholars.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think back to, well, I mean, even you with your publication in 2013, Your Brain on Latino Comics was, I think, a 2009. But I knew that that I wouldn't get tenure if I published it as my first book. I waited about, 5-6 years before I published that.
Mm-hmm.
And now, hopefully, with all the work that we're doing and that you do, our graduate students and our undergraduates will have an easier time, right? So Susan, what is next for you?
Well, I'm working on a project about how female created comic strips from 1976 to the present offer this evolving rhetoric of womanhood, and how these strips depict the women's rights movement in this particularly turbulent time in American history. And again, I'm at the Billie Ireland, again, talking about supporting one another. I had a Caswell grant to go last summer to the Billie Ireland and see all of the amazing, it was like I felt like I was in a treasure. They would bring me these boxes like a treasure, each one, all these amazing artifacts from comics history. But it's a project, I'm looking at some really great comic strips. And I think comic strips also don't get as much attention. And a lot of it's because they're hard to find, hard to access. But I'm looking at these comic strips from about 1976, created by women, until the present, and sort of looking at how they depict particularly the women's rights movement. And it was a great fun because I got to read Kathy, for better, for worse. I look at Sylvia. I also looked at Barbara Brandon Croft's Where I'm Coming From, and Stone Soup, and also Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For. So all these great comic strips. I mean, what a wonderful, fun project. It was fantastic, but it was also sort of depressing sometimes because, things have changed so little. And, I was reading these comic strips and, in the middle of the Me Too movement and thinking, in these 40 years, so little has changed. I mean, there's this sequence in Kathy I've talked about in other places where she's assaulted by her boss, Mr. Pinkley. And really, it could take place in 2020, so little has changed, which is, disappointing. But I think it's interesting to see how relevant these comics really are. So that's the next project that I'm working on and finishing up, and then hopefully continuing to work as well. I have a couple other projects I want to do. I want to keep working on comics pedagogy, but I don't think I'm done with superheroes yet, just because it's so much fun. So again, I feel very, very lucky to have sort of accidentally wandered in this field because I love my job. I'm so lucky that I get to do this. I have to go to work and read, I'm going to read some Thor, followed up with some Kathy, it's a great, great job. And again, and also to get to talk to great colleagues like you and be in this community that is so supportive. So I have lots of projects.
Yeah, I love it. And I can't wait to see them. I love your work, as you know. And so if you were to take a step back from everything, and there's so much happening, where would you say the heartbeat is today in comics? Comic studies, you've already kind of helped us identify some important places that we really need to kind of intervene and kind of enrich. But maybe you can add a little more to this question of the vitality in comics and comic studies today.
Well, I think that I'm very excited about comics today. As you mentioned, a few years ago, I got to be one of the judges for the Eisner Awards. And while I was doing that, I read comics I never would have read. And it was so exciting that there are great comics for kids. There are great comics for middle readers, for every age, every interest. And I remember it was several years ago, but I remember in the short story category, we had some mainstream stories, a Batman, but nominated. But there were also sort of stories. I remember, there was one about being a mom and the challenges of balancing, breastfeeding and work and things like that. And I love the diversity that I see in storytelling and the types of stories that are being told. So that is really exciting to me. I'm also excited to see more conversations between educators, between comics scholars, between fans, and between creators, because I'd like to see even more conversation between the creators and the scholars and the fans, because we can learn from one another. So I'm excited to see more conversations taking place. I'm excited to see the great kinds of stories that are coming out, because you see, I'm thinking about, there's web comics, there's, these long form comics, there's still, the superhero comics. There's just this wonderful diversity in terms of that I see emerging, the types of stories that are told, the creators, the age groups, and it's overwhelming. My pull list is too big right now, but that's exciting, because I think it's wonderful when you have that problem of having too many things to read. So there's a lot going on, I think.
So I imagine that your bedside stand, the proverbial bedside stand, is stacked in all sorts of ways with all of these things. Yeah, I'm excited as well. I'm especially excited by the short form comics for some reason right now. And DC's really kicking it with their graphic novel series for teens. Oh my God, Marjorie Liu and Alex Sanchez and all those folks being hired in for that. I love it. Anyway, Susan, thank you. You've been amazing. Thank you for sharing a little piece of your life and your journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.